Hello, my name's Aaron Barth, and I'm the kid that's got a spirit problem. Yes, it's true, I got a spirit problem. Yes, it's true. Last video, I was starting to use my gift, and I was trying to tell you what God Almighty and the spirits had to say about my story that I told you, and I got ever so far with it. So I'm just gonna pick off where I left off, and here we go. God Almighty of Abraham said that there's no reason to trouble yourself with this gift today, Aaron. There's just no reason to be in God Almighty to say that you have an ability, and you can be in God Almighty to say you have an ability, but you don't have an ability. You really have to believe God Almighty wants to take someone and say that that someone has the right to have an ability, like John Edwards. And God Almighty said, I want Aaron to do his best today, and I want Aaron to get off drugs, and I want Aaron to do the best he can with his spirit problem. Yeah, God Almighty said, people might understand what you're going through, Aaron, and they say, you beat up a puppy. Yeah, you beat up a puppy, and you don't have any right to not emphasize what you did to that puppy, Aaron. What you did was so heinous. And God Almighty said, yeah, and that's the truth, Aaron. And you're the one that beat up that puppy, and you're the one that said the N-word all this time. And God Almighty said, that's the reason why I don't want you to have this ability on YouTube, because you can get yourself in trouble. And God Almighty said, well, it's all on you, Aaron. And God Almighty said, don't think about Michelle Harris, Aaron, because God Almighty said, she's gone and she's not coming back here, and she is the only one that knows where she's at. And God Almighty said, don't look at Michelle Harris like she's not here today in our spirit, saying that we have things in our heart that mean more than murder. And God Almighty said, we don't even know if she was murdered. And God Almighty said, she might have skipped town, and maybe she went somewhere. And God Almighty said, maybe she needs to be in God Almighty to say that she is just a child of God Almighty. And maybe she needs to be in God Almighty to skip town for a reason or another, or she needs to get out of this trouble, and she needs to get out of the Calvin Harris trouble, and she needs to look at her story and say, maybe I don't need an abusive husband, and maybe I love my kids, but I want to teach myself that I am a good mom anyway. And God Almighty said, you have no idea that God Almighty said Michelle Harris is not really found yet. So I do this YouTube video because I got an ability. Yes, I do. I got an ability. I got this gift, and it's kind of like John Edwards. I can tell you what God Almighty said. I can tell you what Jesus said. I can tell you what spirits say. And I thought that maybe I should ask God Almighty where Michelle Harris is at, as long as I got this ability. And God Almighty said, good. And that's about all you need to do, Aaron, is just think about things like that, because God Almighty said that is the difference between you shooting the basketball that God Almighty gave you or passing it. And God Almighty said, it's the algebra and how we read it, people. It is the algebra on how we write it, people. And it's the algebra and how we say it, people. And it's the things we look for that mean that we have eyes like children, like young children, and we are looking for things that are like not that complicated to understand, that you can do 1 + 1 in 1 second in your head, and you can be like, oh, I know where she's at. And God Almighty said, And that is the thing that I learned after I got in trouble with a little story. And God Almighty said, Aaron, explain yourself now. People, that was God Almighty about my story, and that was God Almighty about Michelle. And He wants me to explain how I got in trouble. It's about a guy. It's about that taxi driver, and it's about how I judged him when he said the N word in the taxi driver's seat, and I took it all home with me, and lo and behold, I am the one who said the N word more than he ever did. And I don't really have much time left, but I'll pick it off at the next video. Thanks for watching.